My best regards, Professor Patrick Williams. Thank you for the interview. This interview is for the conference Sketch as Subculture. And can I ask the first question, please? As a scientist, you have dedicated a huge part of your work to studying these subcultures. In your opinion, what are the main reasons why it is necessary to pay attention to this phenomenon in society?
Well, I think as more and more societies become more diverse, and especially with the development and the growth of information and communication technologies, societies become more and more heterogeneous. That is, there's more and more different kinds of people in society that become interested and knowledgeable about different things. And so I think along with this creation of difference within society, there come at least three things. One is the increase in distinctiveness. So by distinctiveness means individuals or groups who want to stand out, who want to be distinct, who want to be different from other people. Second is what I call non-normativity. So that means not being normal. So people that are dissatisfied in some way with what mainstream or dominant culture offers, and they disagree with something and they want to be different from that, or to resist or somehow push back against that definition of what is normal. And then the third is marginality. So that means there are also groups of people who, regardless of what they want, may be put into a minority position or a marginal position. They may be undervalued or underprivileged. And so without any choice of their own, they might be placed in a position where they're different from other people. So I think for all three of these reasons, there are a variety of kinds of people in society that don't necessarily fit into definitions of the mainstream or the dominant society. And for these reasons, subculture is a very useful concept for understanding the culture of these different groups. So their practices, their norms and their values, their beliefs, the ways that they think, the ways they act, and the ways that they feel.
You have one of the works, Subculture Not Dead. What would you underline the main reasons for the existence of subcultures in the 21st century, which retains the relevance of the subculture concept?
About 20 years ago or so, there was a movement, a kind of a reaction against the idea of subculture, the belief that subculture was not really a useful concept anymore. So publications by people like Professor Andy Bennett and some others really argued that we should look beyond subculture and start to theorize some other use some other concepts or theorize other ways of understanding, whether it's young people or marginalized people. I know in many cases it's about studying particular kinds of lifestyle groups, so people that belong to certain music cultures or to generations like youth. But I think as a reaction to that movement away from subculture, what we've seen is a lot of scholars, myself included, argue that there are a variety of experiences that people in society have. And certainly the post-subcultures theory makes sense for some kinds of groups of people, but it doesn't make sense for all groups of people. There are still people who are marginalized in society and have different and unique experiences. There are people that seek to stand out as different or distinct. There are people that are not satisfied with what dominant culture offers and want to push back against that and want to create space for themselves. So that particular article, Subcultures is Not Dead, was a moment in which I looked at a lot of the literature that's being produced on music subcultures, youth subcultures, and other kinds of phenomena to argue that a lot of people are still using the subculture concept, and to kind of, I use that as a way of saying we need to be careful about simply dismissing the idea that subculture is no longer relevant. It is still relevant for some people. And I think that's the most important point, is that subculture is a concept. So in social theory, we should use concepts in very specific ways. They're not just words to be thrown around and to mean anything they want in any situation. So I've tried to develop and to point out in my own work very specific uses of the term in which it should apply to certain kinds of people and then more specifically their cultures. The concept continues to have relevance for certain kinds of groups. I think as long as we have stratified societies, that means people with more power and people with less power, there will be differences. And I don't think it's possible, or at least probable, anytime in the near future, where all members of a society will have the same interests, will have the same beliefs, will share the same values, will be interested in following the same sets of rules. As long as those kinds of differences exist, I think that subculture remains a potentially useful concept. Of course, it depends on how you want to use the word. So at the most basic, the way that the word subculture was used in early subcultural theory, say earlier in the 20th century, as it was practiced and developed, say, at the University of Chicago in the United States, is a very different concept than how it was used and developed in the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies at the University of Birmingham in the UK. So even if you have a term like subculture, you cannot assume or should not assume that that word has a specific conceptual meaning. You must understand how the term is being used. If you want to use it in your own work, you need to be clear in what it means and how you will use it in order to provide some kind of insight into whatever phenomenon that you're studying. So it could have almost infinite meanings in the sense that different scholars could make different definitions of the term. I don't think that's very useful. So, but at the same time, I know that there's not only one meaning of the term. And so that's the most important thing, is that we recognize different traditions of the term, and we're very clear about how we're using it and why we're using it and what we hope to get out of using it when we do our research.
You have studied various subcultures, described their basic concepts and traditions. Have you developed or choose any methods for the study of subcultures for yourself? Perhaps you can advise on some methods for studying subcultures for other scientists, especially in researching of the secret subcultures.
Yes, I've studied a lot of different phenomenon that would be considered subcultural. I've even started projects myself that I believed at the beginning could be called subcultural, but by the time I had collected the data, I decided that subculture was not necessarily the best term. So again, I don't believe in just using the term and sticking with it. I think that the concept needs to match the data that you have. So that gives part of an answer to your question, which is about methods. Because I'm a cultural sociologist, also a social psychologist, I believe that it's really important to understand what things mean for individuals and how they take meanings and use them in their own lives to shape their own practices, their own thinking, their own definitions of reality. So for me, I find that one of the most important methods is ethnographic research, actually spending time with people who might define themselves as subcultural, or who you as the researcher might define as subcultural. Only is if you spend time with these people and watch what is it that they do, how do they think, how do they feel, what kinds of experiences do they have with different other kinds of people in their everyday lives. The more time you spend with them, the more insight you will gain into their understanding of the world. And of course, that's what ethnographers try to do, is to get an understanding of the world from the from the perspective of the participants in our research. So I think that's part. So one is just spending time, of course, doing things like in-depth interviewing also gives us a lot of insight, and also gives us important insight in the sense that observing people lets us know what they do. Talking to people, for example, interviewing people gives us insight into how they talk about what they do, which are two different things. And I think doing the two together gives you a better understanding of their reality. In addition to that, there's many other methods that I think are possible to use. The most kind of broad or generic is a kind of analyzing the discourse that goes on around subcultures, or what we can call subcultural phenomena. So beyond actually interacting with the individuals themselves or talking to them, we recognize that meanings are circulated in other ways. So for example, you can learn a lot about a subculture just by studying, for example, how it exists in the news. The news might give you a very good outsider perspective of what that subculture is. And of course, understanding how a subculture is defined by a mainstream group or by a dominant cultural group is very important, because the participants of a subcultural group are likely to also understand those same meanings. They also might read the news. They also might hear information about themselves from the outside. And so if we can understand what kinds of information floats around outside, it gives us an understanding of what they might be interpreting themselves as they make sense of themselves. I hope that makes sense. And beyond that, I think we can go on into other kinds of methods that may or may not include active participation with the subcultural groups that we study. But I think that anytime we're doing some kind of discourse analysis or research without interacting with the actual individuals involved, I think we need to be aware of the limitations or the constraints that that kind of research has. And then again, only hanging out with insiders also has its own constraints, because it might fail to give you an appreciation of outside definitions of the subculture as well. Of course, with any kind of subculture, you're going to have the problem of access. And one of the reasons I think I started with the point that I differentiate three subcultures in at least three ways: one by distinction and non-normativity, and then by marginality. I think maybe marginal subcultures would be the hardest potentially to access. They may be the groups that feel very vulnerable. And then having an outsider, typically we as researchers are in more privileged positions in society. And so, you know, approaching a vulnerable or marginalized group and saying, hey, I want to understand you and the ways that you live, that could be very threatening to them. And so it may be difficult. Other groups, for example, though, the first, so ones that want to stand out, that want to be different, might be much more open to sharing information about why they want to be different, or what is it that they think makes them unique. And then the middle example, non-normativity, those are people that are dissatisfied or unhappy with some aspect of the status quo or some kind of relationship in mainstream or dominant culture. And oftentimes those people are also very vocal on the one hand about what they don't like, and are happy to share that information, but at the same time may also feel potentially threatened by outsiders who want information about them, because of course a researcher, an outsider, could be an undercover representative of the police or some other kind of authority. And so they may feel threatened in giving out information that could maybe give away too much information about them. So I think even as we talk about these secret subcultures, we need to recognize that there are different levels of access that we can get. I know in my own early research, I grew up as a kind of a subcultural kid. I was involved in punk culture and straight edge subculture as a teenager. And then when I wanted to study the subcultures, I have a lot of insider knowledge. So even now that I'm getting older and have a gray beard and this sort of thing, if I want to hang out with younger punks or other kinds of kids, I have an ability to connect with them because I can speak in the same kinds of subcultural language, so to speak. I can communicate that I share similar values and similar understandings. When you're wanting to study subcultures that are very different from your own perspective, I think that becomes the challenge, is communicating to these people or to these groups that you have a sincere interest in studying them. You need to be able to communicate effectively why it is you're wanting to study them. What would they get out of that research relationship? Not only, hey, I want to study you so I can write a new book, but maybe, hey, I want to study you and I think that this information might help you, it might help other kinds of people in similar situations, or whatever it is. Certainly, the better that you can connect with those groups and convince them of your own sincerity as the researcher, I think the better chance you have of conducting useful research.
In your opinion, is there such a phenomenon subculture in a subculture? And what features of its research can be?
One of the, I mean, of course, in English, the word sub typically means a part of something else or some component. So it means something inside of something larger. So I think by definition, a lot of people understand that subcultures are parts of a larger heterogeneous society and culture. And so conceptually, I think it's very easy to take that same idea and say, even if you have a mainstream culture and you have a certain population within a society that wants to think differently, you can separate out that group from the larger society, and you can understand that that smaller group may have its own culture. And that's what we can call a subculture. But even within that network of people, there's no reason to assume they will all think alike. I think that's something typically that outsiders assume, that, hey, there's a punk and hey, there's another punk, they're the same thing. But our research has shown that that's not at all the case. So as one basic example, experiences within punk subculture can be very different based on class, and very different based on race, and very different based on gender. So there's been a lot of research that shows that women's participation in punk subculture is very different than males' participation. Or a middle class person's participation may be something that where they can move in and out of a punk subculture or move in and out of participation as they want, whereas a person from an extremely marginalized background, say, who has maybe no parents or is a runaway or is homeless or something like that, that connects with a punk culture, may not have the opportunity to move in and out of that culture. That culture may be a lifeline for them. So the experiences will be very different. And this is one of the reasons that I believe that studying subculture, we need to pay very close attention to the idea of culture itself and what culture is. Culture is sets of meanings that circulate. So again, even within one subcultural group, you can have different kinds of people circulating different kinds of information. So this is why women within some male-dominated subcultures may break off and decide to kind of form their own resistant subculture to a resistant subculture. So this is why you have punk that's supposed to be resistant to mainstream culture. And subsequently, you have the breakout of Riot Girl, which is a kind of resistance to the male domination of punk subculture. So these things are possible in many different forms.
How do you think, what influences the choice of a person to interact with one or another subculture?
Well, as I shared in a bit earlier in the interview, my own interest in subculture is because I grew up very interested and personally involved in subcultures. They were very meaningful for me, both in terms of my kind of unhappiness or dis-ease that I had interacting in a lot of kind of popular mainstream teenage culture. I wasn't necessarily comfortable in a lot of the situations and doing a lot of the things that mainstream kids were doing. And I found that I found other people who thought similar to me. And so I developed very meaningful relationships with some of those people. And as we all shared what we disliked, maybe about our high school culture or about the larger adult society or the adult cultures that we lived in, we kind of mutually moved ourselves into these alternative or different spaces. So I think that, at least in my experience, was the primary reason. Other people have very different reasons. So criminologists, at least some criminologists may come to subcultural research for a very different reason, which is they may believe in the power and the goodness of mainstream society, or believe that society does very good things for people, and that subcultures form as ways of let's say, poor reactions to the problems they experience in society. So there will be many kinds of social scientists that see subcultures as problems. And then they will approach subcultural groups in terms of, how can I help you become better? How can I identify your problems and fix those? Well, I think that's fine from a certain perspective, but I think if you approach from that outside definition and you don't try to understand from the inside what it is that they're experiencing and how they're experiencing it, I think you will be limited in what things you can offer members of these subcultures in terms of improving their lives. Some of them may simply not understand that there are better options out there. You know, marginalized groups may be cut off from so much of mainstream society. You know, so much of mainstream society these days is about consumerism and consumer identities, and we identify ourselves in terms of our lifestyles and what we can afford to buy and what we can afford to do. If you come from a very marginalized position without access to money, you may not have those opportunities. And so those kinds of people may really struggle to be fixed, so to speak, in the way that a criminologist or a social worker might want to fix those groups. So again, learning to see from the inside, I think, is the most important thing, whether you agree with those people or not. And that's another, I guess, a final point to make is we don't have to agree with all of the things that members of subcultures do, but we need to try and respect at some level that those things that they do are meaningful to them. So I think of subcultures that may develop around depression. So people who, you know, anorexia, so the Ana subculture, or subcultures around people who cut themselves, for example. That's often been connected to emo and other kinds of music subcultures. We don't necessarily have to say it's okay for you to harm yourself. But if we don't understand why they're harming themselves and what meanings it has, we'll be very limited in how we can offer assistance or really meaningful insight into their lives.